Hello, everyone. I wanted to welcome you to today's webinar, Building Energy Performance Standards and the Importance of Financing to Fund the Necessary Upgrades. We will discuss how 3 jurisdictions are implementing building performance standards and the financial instruments that can be complementary to fund the necessary upgrades for building owners. My name is Stephen Nadell. I'm the Executive Director at ACEEE, and I will be your moderator today. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping announcements. Your screen is customizable. Feel free to make the various windows as large or small as you would like. You can even minimize them to drop to the menu at the bottom of your screen. Click through the widgets at the bottom of the screen to be sure you aren't missing any of the options available. I'd also note that presentations can be downloaded as PDFs from the presentation list in the menu. Attendees are all in listen-only mode, but can submit questions through the Q&A box at any time during the webcast. We will respond to questions at the end of the presentations verbally. If it's a quick answer, we may be able to do it via chat while things are going on. And again, Q&A can be accessed in the menu at the bottom of your screen if it is not already visible. You may have to move down slightly on your screen to see it. And now I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. In addition to me, we have Alfred Griffin, the president of the New York Green Bank, Emily Salzberg, who's the managing director for the Building Standards and Performance Unit at the Washington State Department of Commerce, John Mandak, who's the CEO of the Urban Green Council in New York City, and Eli Hobson, who's the CEO of the DC Green Bank in the District of Columbia. With that, I'm going to move to give some introductory remarks to help frame things here, and to talk a little bit about mandatory building performance standards across the different cities in order to help frame the subsequent discussions. So these standards, we now have commercial standards in New York City, Washington, D.C., Washington State. We'll hear more about those. But we also have these standards in Tokyo, Reno, Nevada, St. Louis, and the Netherlands. ACEEE had a report came out in June with lots of details if you want more information. I would also note that in Boulder, there are targets for rental housing. France has residential standards, and there are a number of other jurisdictions in the U.S. and Canada that are considering these standards. At this point, the Tokyo, Boulder, United Kingdom standard, that's a rental standard, Reno in the Netherlands, are being implemented. The rest are still working out the details and haven't yet begun, but we'll hear a bunch about that process from our 3 presenters shortly. This is a list of some of the jurisdictions that are actively considering mandatory building performance standards. I pass this on to you for your reference later. I'm not going to be talking about all of these. There's also quite a few policies that are not quite full building performance standards, where they look at whole building performance, whether it's energy audit and tune-up requirements, lighting upgrade requirements, other upgrade requirements, mandatory labeling. And in this slide, we give some examples of jurisdictions that have these. Further details are in our June paper. Now, one of the reasons why people are doing mandatory building performance standards is voluntary retrofit programs, while very important, have typically moved slowly. In the residential sector in the U.S., we're retrofitting probably less than 0.2% of homes each year. So at those rates, it will take us more than 500 years to retrofit all homes. Given the urgency of climate change, we can't wait 500 years. For the commercial sector, the retrofit rates are a bit greater. Our best estimates are somewhere between 0.8 and 2.2% per year. Yes, that's a fairly broad range. The data is not very good. But if we use the midpoint, that's 67 years to retrofit all buildings. And generally, we are trying to talk about decarbonization in 20 to 30 years. So again, while it's better than residential, it's not enough. Hence, people are increasingly interested in mandatory standards. In our June study, we looked at energy savings available from mandatory standards. This kind of summarizes that. If we get average of 30% savings in 2/3 of the residential commercial buildings, together we can reduce energy use and carbon emissions, energy use by almost 5 quadrillion BTUs, carbon emissions by about 170 million metric tons. These are about 11% reductions in energy use in CO2. So a nice contribution toward decarbonization, but much more will be needed besides. And that's just based on these assumptions of 30% savings and 2/3 do it. Obviously, if those go up, the savings will go up as well. Now, we do have 3 jurisdictions here. This is a little bit of summary information about those jurisdictions and comparing them. They all were enacted in 2019. They all cover commercial buildings. DC also covers multifamily. New York City, I'll say many, but not all multifamily. And John will go into a little bit more on those details. They vary on the size threshold. In Washington State, it ultimately covers buildings 50,000 square feet and up. In DC, it's ultimately 10,000 square feet and up, but it phases in gradually. New York City is in between. In the case of Washington State, it's a site energy intensity as a metric. DC uses a variation on energy intensity, but using Energy Star score, whereas in New York City, it's carbon dioxide intensity. Again, the speakers will say a little bit more about that. In general, for Washington State and Washington, D.C., the first standards take effect in 2026. So buildings effectively had 7 years to prepare. In New York City, it's a little bit sooner, but only for about 20% of the building stock to start. Again, you'll hear more details later. In general, the standards in Washington is still be determined, but it will at least be the median for, no more than the median for that building type. Whereas in DC, it's at least the median for that building type, but there's also an option of reducing energy use by 20%. In New York City, they want a 40% reduction by 2030, 80% by 2050, but more modest targets in 2040. Typically, these get revised every 5 years, and without going into all the details, there will also be technical assistance available in each of the jurisdictions. So one of the things that is complementary to financing, meaning loans, are utility incentives. And ACEEE is putting the finishing touches on a paper on the role of utility incentives in building performance standards. Across the different jurisdictions, not just these 3, but many more we talked to, the utility incentives will still generally apply prior to the effective date, 2024, 2026. After the effective date, the incentives will generally still apply for exceeding the standards. And the jurisdictions are still discussing if there is a role for incentives after the effective date, just to bring them up to the standard, to effectively aid the laggards. Clearly, the building owners would like the incentives. I'd say generally the utilities want to be involved if the regulators find it permissible. I would note that the owners can just pay penalties in these jurisdictions. They don't have to upgrade and meet the performance. So if we want to save energy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there may be a role for incentives rather than just fines. And in particular, not all building types are equal. In particular, it's going to be more difficult, we're finding in this forthcoming research, for affordable housing and other hard-to-reach building types. Maybe others, but at a minimum, that we think there's a compelling case for at least those areas. So with that, I will, here's contact information in case you have questions for me. But with that, I'd like to move on to our next speaker, who is Alfred Griffin. Alfred is an industry leader in developing innovative solutions in support of the financing of renewable energy generation and energy efficiency projects, and brings 25 years of experience in banking and finance to the New York Green Bank, which he now is CEO of. He will give some welcoming remarks and discuss the overall financeability of these programs broadly. So, Alfred, over to you.
Okay, Steve, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you to ACEEE for organizing this webinar on this very important topic. Good afternoon, and welcome to all of you joining us today. As we all know, the opportunity for energy efficiency is tremendous, and the need to take advantage of energy efficiency measures is absolutely critical for all of us to meet our goals of 100% renewable energy and a carbon-free economy in the future. And the New York Green Bank, as most of you are probably aware, was established as a Governor Andrew Cuomo initiative in December of 2013. And after building our team and putting our operations in place, we've now closed over $1 billion of transactions, with a good portion of those being energy efficiency, but not nearly as many energy efficiency transactions as we would like. So we're very excited about policy and regulatory regimes that should trigger more demand for energy efficiency. And it's a continuing conversation as why more does not get done. I think we all know it's very low-hanging fruit in many cases, proven technologies, proven business models, credible providers, whether it's large energy services companies or small energy services companies, all sorts of businesses that know what they're doing, that are highly credible, and offer positive IRR opportunities to building owners. But things just don't get done at the rate we might expect. So I've often asked, why is this? And, we've dealt with a lot of credible parties since I've been at the New York Green Bank, and even before when I was still at Citi, that would indicate substantial pipelines of opportunities using leasing models, loan product models, energy savings arrangement models, whatever it may be, where there are building owners highly interested in taking advantage of the services they were offering, which often combined both the work getting done and the financing for such work. But then the transactions just wouldn't happen, or wouldn't happen at the rate any of us might expect. And it really comes down, I think, in many cases to a lack of prioritization. If you're an owner of a building, you have lots of different priorities and needs for your building, and energy efficiency retrofit work, in many cases, is one of those areas that can wait till next quarter because something's more pressing this quarter and the next quarter and then the next, and so on and so on. And years have passed before action has actually taken place, and in many cases not yet taken place. So I hope that having mandatory building performance standards will make some of this work that needs to be done, that in many cases provides positive economic value and a better, more comfortable building, will get done because it becomes a priority. There are date certains upon which certain measures need to take place, and that helps prioritize this along with other building needs. So once a priority, then building owners will need to work with the various service providers that can provide energy efficiency and or renewable energy type services. And upon determining, what work needs to actually be done, the next question will be, well, how will we finance it? It may be that some building owners have cash in hand to just go ahead and fund the work to be done. It may be that some building owners, they need to get more equity capital or decide to get equity capital from their owners to fund such projects. It may be in some cases that the senior mortgage is refinanced and part of the use of proceeds is the work that needs to be done. But then there are lots of other financing structures that are very specific to energy efficiency and clean energy that are available. and have been utilized in the past and are available for future financing needs. And these can be finance provided via a lease structure, where the building owner, rather than borrowing the money in form of a loan, instead chooses to use a leasing construct where a third-party financier actually is the in effect owner of the equipment and leases it back to the building owner, which can often have some beneficial impacts in terms of financing cost, as well as providing a form of financing that's not debt in form on companies' balance sheets. There are energy savings arrangement type structures where it looks a little bit more like a power purchase agreement in the generation space, where you make payments based on actual savings. So rather than a loan or a lease where there's a fixed amount of payments that have to be made regardless of performance, an energy savings arrangement would mean that the building owner would pay some share of actual savings, meaning that that payments are only made if there are in fact savings that occur. So oftentimes these are structured such that the building owner will always have some savings, even during the period of time in which payments are being used to repay the financing. It could be debt secured by the equipment, or debt secured by a subordinated building lien, or debt secured by equity in the building, but clearly subordinated to the mortgage holder. There are various approaches we've been working with building owners on, including tenant finance approaches, where we would work with building owners to provide financing for tenants that look to do energy efficiency work, and we would provide that financing. The financing would come from New York Green Bank, but the building owner or the property management company would be the intermediary working with the tenants to provide that financing on our behalf. So we would be providing wholesale financing sort of behind the scenes to the building owner. That's not recourse to the building owner, but recourse to the tenants. Commercial PACE, of course, is an area that can be very attractive in certain circumstances, and certainly there have been some good announcements in New York City around commercial PACE over the last week or so. In addition to financing payments that are coming from the building owners over time, we can also finance various state or city incentives. So in New York, there's a program called Pay for Performance, where certain payments would be made by NYSERDA based upon the actual performance. So there's a cash flow coming from NYSERDA as well as the building owner, and we can monetize both and monetize other forms of incentives as well. We've done that in a number of situations since we've existed. These are all approaches that New York Green Bank has financed. We'd like to do a lot more. I'm confident other financiers will say the same, and will particularly say the same when it's clear that there's a real prioritization among building owners to get this work done and real deal flow to be had. Because where there's certainty of deal flow, you're much more likely to have capital be made available and financing organizations to dedicate resources to support that market than if there's not certainty of deal flow. So some of these performance standards should help clarify that deal flow looking forward. So I look forward to hearing more detail as to the new mandates. Look forward to future months and years with a lot more energy efficiency work being done, and therefore a lot more for us at New York Green Bank and for other financiers to finance. One thing I've learned since being with New York Green Bank, and it'll be 7 years now in November, is that where there is good policy and a good regulatory framework, market activity will be stimulated. And I've felt very fortunate to be in New York, where we have great state leadership that has been putting forth very strong policy that has stimulated markets and giving us a lot of interesting transactions to finance. And I'm looking forward to more of that good policy and more of these good regulatory frameworks, such as those being discussed today. And where there's market activity in this sector, there will be a need for finance. There are oftentimes significant upfront expenditures required for long-lived assets and long-term paybacks, meaning that suits itself very well to financing structures. And we at New York Green Bank stand ready to provide this financing, and I would encourage any of you to reach out to us to let us know how we can help, whether you are a building owner, a services provider, an ESCO, another financing entity, whoever you may be. If you're in this sector and have ideas and opportunities for energy efficiency work to be done that requires financing, we encourage you to reach out and speak to New York Green Bank. So I will leave it at that. I look forward to hearing about the measures these various geographies are putting forth that we'll hear more about today to help stimulate more market activity. So thank you again, and Steve, I'll turn it back to you. I think you may be on mute.
How's that? Very good. Thank you very much, Alfred. And I see a few questions coming in, but we'll handle those at the end. Alfred, if you want to go into the Q&A, some of them that might be easy, you can just answer directly. But at this point, we will turn to our second speaker, Emily Salzberg from Washington State. Emily has over 15 years of experience administering, evaluating, providing technical assistance for energy efficiency programs in the Northwest. Her experience includes low-income weatherization, community-based efficiency programs, technology research, market development, and energy code implementation. She will be talking a bit about Washington State's Clean Buildings Law, including some financing that is already been authorized and is about to hit the streets. So, Emily, to you.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Well, Alfred started out with good afternoon, and I'll start with good morning from the West Coast. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today, and thank you to ACEEE for inviting me to participate on this panel. My name is Emily Salzberg, and I work with a talented team of staff at the Washington State Department of Commerce. We're within the State Energy Office. We're currently working to stand up the Clean Buildings Law here in the state of Washington. The Clean Buildings Law is an energy performance standard for existing non-residential buildings. In Washington State, not unlike your own likely, buildings account for 27% of our total greenhouse gas emissions. However, it's the sector that has the greatest percentage of increase in GHG emissions over the last 15 years. So in other words, we have a lot of work to do, and we have a lot of opportunity working in buildings. The Department of Commerce is the administrator and enforcer of the state's Clean Buildings Law. Our agency's purpose is to strengthen communities. Commerce touches every aspect of community and economic development. So like Alfred spoke to in New York with the leadership there, same too in Washington. Our governor and our legislature recognizes that it's in the state's interest to maximize the full potential of energy efficiency. We do this through standards, incentives, programs, and codes to both keep energy costs low and to meet our greenhouse gas emissions reductions goals over time. So as a result, the Clean Buildings Law was authorized in House Bill 1257 in the 2019 legislative session. The law has different phases of implementation that I'll briefly talk about in this presentation today. The law itself applies to existing non-residential buildings over 50,000 square feet. Some building types are exempt, such as industrial or agricultural uses. The law is based on ASHRAE Standard 100, 2018. This is the reference standard for our program. Commerce is responsible for developing rules, and we need to have this completed by November of this next year. Actually, of this year, just shy of 2 months away. We also need to notify building owners of the requirements of this law and their opportunity for the incentive program by this next summer. The Early Adopter Incentive Program launches July of 2021. We'll then work towards supporting mandatory compliance starting in 2026. So I'm going to speak a bit about the requirements of the standard itself, which will be a mandatory standard starting in 2026. And then I'll work from the next steps to get us there towards mandatory compliance. So as I mentioned, compliance for all covered buildings starts in 2026. And we're going to start with the largest buildings first. So those buildings over 200,000 square feet. Mid-sized buildings will be due in 2027, and the smaller subset of buildings in 2028. So these are the buildings between 50,000 and 90,000 square feet. Compliance is verified on a 5-year basis. Building owners will need to resubmit documentation every 5 years thereafter. All buildings covered by the law, regardless of energy use intensity, must complete an energy management plan, an operations and maintenance plan, and they must benchmark the building. Buildings that exceed the energy use intensity targets by building type or that don't have a target must also then conduct an ASHRAE 2 level audit and implement efficiency measures to bring the building within that target or demonstrate that they've installed all cost-effective measures available. As part of establishing the standard, we had to develop targets by building type. The law requires Commerce to set targets, as Steve mentioned, no greater than average for each building type, but it didn't specify the minimum for target setting. Because Washington did not have a statewide benchmarking requirement prior to the standard, we didn't have a statewide data set to determine the averages in the state. Commerce partnered with 2 consultants, SBW and the 2050 Institute, to determine energy use intensity means by building type, using a regional data set called the Commercial Building Stock Assessment, and then using the national Commercial Buildings Energy Consumption data. We also cross-referenced this analysis with the City of Seattle, who's had a benchmarking program and law in place for a number of years. Commerce has proposed rules that would set the targets 15% below average. Some stakeholders have argued that this is too stringent. Others would have liked to see the targets set more aggressively. Commerce is required to update these targets again in 2029 and every 5 years thereafter. Once the state begins mandatory compliance, there is processes in place for building owners to apply for conditional compliance. There are some exempt building types and other exemptions, including economic hardship. Commerce does have the authority to assess penalty fees if building owners fail to comply with the law, and these fines will go towards our low-income programs here in Washington State. Following our rulemaking and target setting work, the next phase of our work is building owner notification. So we need to identify all eligible buildings here in the state and notify the owners of the law. We also need to notify them of the early adopter incentive opportunities. The county assessors play a key role in our ability to bring together a statewide building catalog, which doesn't currently exist. We're working with each county, in addition to leveraging other statewide data sources, to create this database, and we'll update it every 2 years. This database will serve as a portal for building owners, managers, operators, and administrators to apply for the incentives and to track compliance over time. So the law also requires that Commerce administer an incentive program for early adopters of the standard. It's very important to note that this is a state incentive, and it can be administered in addition to utility conservation incentives. So close partnership with our utilities in the state is critical, along with the Department of Revenue. We're also required to provide a customer support and technical assistance program. This will be a key component to our incentive program. While Commerce is the administrator of the program, the utilities actually provide the incentive payment to the building owners. They then receive a tax credit from revenue. The law states that utilities serving over 25,000 customers must participate in the program. Utilities with less customers may, but are not required to participate. We may find that we have eligible buildings in service areas where their utilities either don't or can't participate in the program. The incentive program is available for all buildings covered by the law, in addition to multifamily buildings. However, multifamily buildings are not required to comply with the mandatory standard itself in 2026. They are eligible to receive the incentive. So to qualify, the building must be 15 EUI over the target for that building type, and they must install a package of measures to reduce the EUI at or below the target that we've set. The building must be brought within full compliance of the standard. It's a performance-based incentive, and it requires 12 months of utility usage data post-upgrade to verify that those conditions have been met. The incentive is 85 cents per square foot, and we have $75 million available to administer. Commerce and our stakeholders have explored issues of equity and access for the limited pool of incentive money we do have available. We want to ensure that we create opportunities for minority, veteran, and women-owned businesses, and we also want to ensure that we have geographic equity. The market in the city of Seattle looks very different, for example, than the market in some of our rural communities in the state. So because this is a performance-based incentive, there's a fairly long time horizon to the projects, and building owners in some cases won't have certainty that they'll meet the threshold after they install measures. Process-wise, building owners will benchmark their buildings to determine the EUI. If they're 15 over the target, they'll fill out an application if they wish to participate in our portal. Commerce will then place a reservation on the incentive payment and will coordinate with the participating utilities. Building owners will need to come into full compliance with the standard and will need to verify building improvements with 12 consecutive months of utility usage data. Only at that point in time will the utility release the incentive portion. I mentioned earlier that state incentive dollars can be used in conjunction with utility incentive offerings. The utilities can pay out their incentives depending on their program requirements, which may be after installing measures or it might be after a quality assurance site visit. But the state investment can only be released after that 12 months of utility usage data. So as Steve mentioned in his introduction, many of those utility programs and incentives will change once this becomes a mandatory standard. What we've worked to create here in Washington is a standard, the framework for that standard, that utilities could then incent a certain performance or threshold below the targets that we've set by building type. We've also preserved that flexibility for local jurisdictions here in the state. So if we have cities or counties that want to choose a more stringent target for their building types, they certainly can do so. Enforcement, though, would be in their purview and in their criteria to monitor. So if anybody is interested in learning more about our program, we do have a webpage set up on Commerce's website, and we're updating this page as we go. It's been very focused on our rulemaking activity to date, and the content will be transitioning as we shift our sites to administering the incentive program and providing technical assistance. We do have a distribution list if anybody is interested in receiving updates. There's a link to sign up on our webpage. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that may come up during the Q&A session.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily. We appreciate your giving an overview on what Washington is doing, and I would note that you mentioned cities and counties can go beyond, and people may have noticed that Seattle was on my list of some jurisdictions that is thinking of enacting standards. That conceivably could be an example of that. But now let's move on to the Big Apple, to New York City. We have John Mandyke with us, who is CEO of the Urban Green Council since 2018. Before that, he had a 25-year career at United Technologies Corporation, ultimately serving as Chief Sustainability Officer for them. And John will cover some of the impacts as a result of New York City's building performance standard. Take it away, John.
Steve, thank you so much. Thanks to ACEEE for inviting us and for doing this panel, which has been great so far. For those of you who aren't familiar with Urban Green, we are an environmental nonprofit organization based in New York City. Our mission is to transform buildings for a sustainable future in New York City and around the world. Increasingly, we see New York as an ideal urban laboratory for global climate policy. And so we are engaging with green building councils around the world to import best ideas and to share best ideas so that we can collaborate on a global approach to buildings and climate change. We do 4 key activities at Urban Green. We convene experts to solve big problems. Mayor Bloomberg appointed Urban Green, for example, to develop the city's resiliency plan after Superstorm Sandy. We do research to inform policy decisions and to make market data more available so that the private sector can act. We do advocacy. We do a lot of public policy work. Well, I'll show you an example of that with the carbon law in New York City. And we do education and training, not only in New York, but across the United States and Canada for the building trades. We do all that because buildings matter, and they particularly matter in New York City, where buildings account for nearly 70% of our carbon emissions. So we have a law in New York City to reduce carbon emissions 80% by 2050. We will not get there unless we go through buildings, and that's the work that our organization does. And we have a lot at stake in New York when it comes to climate change. New York has $3 trillion of insured coastal properties vulnerable to climate change. Let me just say that again, $3 trillion. That's twice the GDP of Canada. So we have a lot at stake financially when it comes to climate change and to reducing carbon emissions. And for New York, this isn't theory, this is reality. This is sea level observations at the Battery in New York and Lower Manhattan. This is where the ocean's tide reached the shores of Manhattan. Over the last 100 years, New York Harbor is up a full foot, 12 inches. In fact, sea level rise is higher, disproportionately higher in this part of the United States. So we only have to see a storm like Sandy, which was a tropical storm when it hit, not even a hurricane, to see the damage that climate change can create. Superstorm Sandy left a $20 billion bill in New York City that we are still paying for with subway repairs, with the incursion of salt water into subway tunnels. So we sat back in Urban Green and said, what do we do to put buildings on path to reach an 80% carbon reduction by 2050? Several years ago, we formed something called the 80 by 50 Buildings Partnership, where we brought together 70 experts from architects, engineers, developers, environmental groups, environmental justice groups, academia. We brought the whole industry together, labor unions from 42 organizations. We met 80 times over 8 months to come up with 21 consensus recommendations for how buildings could be put on path to reduce carbon emissions 80% by 2050. We developed something called the Blueprint for Efficiency that we delivered to the New York City Council 2 years ago. The City Council was waiting for Urban Green's report to start drafting its legislation, which became Local Law 97, which is the carbon reduction law in New York City. Many elements of the Blueprint for Efficiency served as the architecture and the backbone for this new law, which delivers the largest carbon reduction of any city in the world. So this is how the law works. It covers buildings that are 25,000 square feet and above, which was Urban Green's recommendation. When you draw the line there, we have 1 million buildings in New York City. When you draw the line at 25,000 square feet and above, you get to a population of about 50,000 buildings. Those 50,000 buildings cover about 60% of the floor area in New York and represent about 50% of the carbon emissions for buildings. You can see in the box chart here that the largest single building type covered by the law are large multifamily buildings. And many of you know that that's a different terrain in the green building and energy efficiency world. A lot of our focus in New York has been on the commercial buildings. Local Law 97 brings us directly into multifamily, so we have to have an approach that covers both. The law sets carbon caps by 10 different occupancy groups. These are just 3 examples here. The first one is multifamily apartments. Second one is office. Third one is hotels. Just look at the office in the middle there. In 2024, office buildings have to reach an 8.46 carbon intensity. That's the kilograms of CO2 per square foot. It's just an absolute hard cap. And then you can see in 2030, that cap significantly tightens to a much higher level across the board. There are 10 occupancy groups here. When this law was first drafted, there were 3. Urban Green got it pushed to 10. Honestly, there needs to be about 80. So there's more work to do, but this is the first step that we have. This is how the law roughly works representatively. So these are those 50,000 buildings plotted by emissions, with on the left side those with lower emissions, the right side those were higher emissions. In 2024, the first cap that I just showed you kicks in, and it impacts about 20% of the properties. So the idea here is those that have higher emissions have to do something first. And so in 2024, the first cap kicks in. And then in 2030, the second cap kicks in, which covers about 75% or about 37,500 buildings that will have to reduce carbon by 2030. The law is designed to keep going, with additional caps that will be anticipated in 2035, 2040, 2045, and eventually 2050 to get to the 80% reduction. With these 2 caps, we get to a 40% reduction over a 2005 baseline. What that means practically is a 26% reduction from now until 2030, given the gains that have already been achieved since 2005. So there are several ways to comply. The first is buildings reduce their carbon intensity. They do that through energy efficiency, or that they do that through lower carbon energy sources. So you could switch fuels from oil to natural gas, for example. So you reduce carbon intensity. Second way you comply is you use offsets or deductions. So a 10% offset is allowed for in the law. That's yet to be defined, and so we're waiting to see what that is. There are credits for renewable energy. In fact, a building could meet 100% of its obligations by using renewable energy, which is a great source to jumpstart a greener grid. The issue is there's no renewable energy to buy right now in New York, and so this is a chicken and egg scenario, and we hope a lot more will be on board soon. And then there are deductions also allowed for clean distributed energy. Third way you comply is you pay the fine. There are hundreds and hundreds of buildings that will never meet the cap in New York City because the cap is blind to what happens in the building. Cap is a simple measure, but it penalizes density, which is counterintuitive to sustainable design. So we have very, very super efficient buildings in New York City. Some of them are LEED Platinum buildings that will never, ever meet this cap because they have 10,000 people in the building. The building operates 24/7. It has data centers. It has trading floors. There simply isn't enough energy to reduce to get that building below the cap. And so those buildings will be forced to pay a fine, or what we hope is those buildings would be able to trade carbon so they can comply. Urban Green worked hard to get into the law a requirement that the city look at carbon trading as a possible means for compliance in this bill, and this is what it would look like. And in this diagram, you'll see that building B is 3 units over its carbon cap. This could be the building that has high density with a lot of people in it. Building A, you could see, has the ability as a long runway to get below its carbon cap by 3 units. Why shouldn't building A be able to sell its excess reduction to building B that cannot get below the cap? It's one thing to pay a fine in this law, but the fine doesn't get you a carbon reduction. We need the carbon reduction in New York, and we think carbon trading is an ideal way to do that. Urban Green just published a landmark report on this in June. We identified 11 program design options for carbon trading, and then a menu of 59 policies under those 11 big program design areas for cities to consider, not only New York City, but any city in the world. In fact, we formed a collaboration with Hong Kong, Singapore, London, and Toronto to look at this idea as a new climate tool. The folks from Tokyo, which had gone first, sat on our committee and provided a great overview of their program design. We hope to take this to a new level. We also think that carbon trading is a very interesting financing source to fund carbon reductions in environmental justice areas, which is a big priority in New York. This is a panel about finance, and so I just want to wrap up with just a few comments on finance and the important role it'll play. We believe that the carbon caps in New York could create a $20 billion market for energy retrofits that you can see here on the slide. This is analysis we've done and is published on our website. If this comes to fore, which we believe it will, it'll be the largest energy retrofit market in the country, and I believe the largest energy retrofit market in the world. So with markets come opportunity. Alfred told us that at the beginning, and so we see lots of opportunity. We particularly want to see opportunity for new technologies because that's what we need in New York to meet these aggressive caps. We need new business models. We need new technologies. We need a new way to think about retrofits. And we want people to see that there is a market opportunity and $20 billion is on the table for that. Secondly, the law that passed came with a suite of other bills, including the establishment of a commercial PACE program in New York City, which is just getting started. We think PACE financing is ideal in this market for this very reason, to reduce energy to meet the caps. And the low-cost financing offered by commercial PACE will be important. And so that's a new financial instrument now available in New York City that we hope will be successful. And then finally, if we're successful with carbon trading, that will create an entire new market, an entire new capital stream worth billions of dollars. And how we point that market will be critically important. And that's why we think part of that market can be pointed to fund carbon reduction and environmental justice neighborhoods. But overall, that's going to be a new market that needs to work and work well for us to get to our reduced caps. So I want to thank Steve and the team at ACEEE for all the work that you're doing and for putting on this panel. And I look forward to answering your questions when we get to that part of the program.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, John. And again, if you have questions for John or any of the speakers, use the Q&A box button at the bottom of your screen. What we'll do now is go to the very last presentation on the District of Columbia. We have Eli Hobson, who is the CEO for the DC Green Bank. He's an attorney and clean energy expert, previously served as vice president of both Cube Hydro Partners as well as Eagle Creek Renewable Energy. Eli will discuss some of the details of DC's building performance standards and what the DC Green Bank is doing with regard to financing. So Eli, all yours.
Thank you, Steve. And thanks to ACEEE for hosting this discussion. A little bit of quick overview on the DC Green Bank. We are a brand new organization. I started in April as the first employee, and we're really designed to be the supporting financial arm for the city's clean energy, clean economy goals. So with that in mind, quick overview today. I'll walk through a quick background on the Green Bank, and then as Steve mentioned, I'll give an overview of Sustainable DC and our building energy performance standards. Although please keep in mind, the Green Bank is not the implementer of those standards. We're not the regulatory arm. We're supporting with financing and other financial support. And then I'll give a quick overview of the financing options that we have, both available now and also that we're designing and planning to release soon to support the building energy performance standards effort. DC Green Bank's sort of three central pillars are sustainability, clean economy, and inclusive prosperity. Sustainability, we're focused on climate change. It's the largest challenge that we all face, and recent events, as Emily was noting earlier, with the wildfires out west, with the hurricane season that we're facing, just clearly outline how we all need to be focused on that as goal number one. Clean economy, really creating local jobs in DC, local energy jobs and sustainability jobs, and creating those long-term employment and revenue options for all of our residents. And our final pillar is inclusive prosperity, to focus on benefits that reach all of the residents of DC, regardless of the geography, race, income level, employment status, et cetera. So making sure that the programs that we offer are available to all of our residents and are providing those long-term benefits that we see from a clean economy. Our initial focus as the Green Bank is looking at 4 different sectors. The solar market in DC is very robust, particularly given the price of our SRECs, which we expect to be relatively high for the foreseeable future. So that's where we've started our first projects, our solar construction loans. We're also looking at building efficiency, obviously the topic today. But outside of buildings, transportation electrification is a key focus area for us as we are looking at more advanced topics, more cutting edge financing. And then also DC has a stormwater abatement credit trading program that's been operating since 2014, but is still in the early stages in terms of market design. We're looking at trying to support that market and growth. We're particularly interested in it as it is another area where there are long-term opportunities for income streams, for mission-driven organizations, for affordable housing across the city. And as we are a green bank following in the footsteps of the New York Green Bank, Connecticut Green Bank, and others, our central focus is not to be a competitor to private capital and existing sources of capital. It's to lead the way, to provide support, to help create new markets and bring those markets to fruition in DC. So whether that's providing credit support, whether it's providing some participation, there's a variety of flexible options that we have to really try and partner with private capital. When we look at the need in DC, initial estimates are that there's easily $2 billion worth of climate investment that needs to be made with building energy performance standards. I expect that number to go up. Our initial public capitalization of $100 million is obviously not going to meet that full need. We can only succeed if we bring in additional dollars and we partner with the private sector. Overall, DC has been very aggressive, and as has been echoed throughout this presentation, leadership from the highest levels. We have strong support from Mayor Bowser and the council, committed to a zero carbon economy by 2050. Key pieces of that, 50% renewable energy by 2032, requiring net zero new buildings eventually, and also eventually moving to net zero retrofits. Overall, looking at dramatic reductions across the board, and particularly in buildings. In DC, buildings are, as was noted for New York City, where over 70% of climate emissions are sourced from buildings. With respect to the Building Energy Performance Standard in DC, the first piece of setting the standard is what is the benchmark. The Clean Energy Act of 2008 required the benchmarks to be set, initially starting with DC-owned buildings and then ramping up eventually to the smaller private buildings, reaching, as Steve noted earlier, that 10,000 square foot threshold in calendar year 2024 for benchmarking. We also will be requiring on a 3-year cycle, independent third-party data verification. That hasn't started yet, but that will start in 2023. The DC's performance standard moves on the cycle every 6 years. We have added an extra year in this initial cycle, just given the current state of the economy and the pandemic, so as not to add additional stresses on the real estate market while that is ongoing. But generally speaking, it works as others have noted, that there's a period of time. Over that period of time, you have to meet the standard of performance minimum is the local medium Energy Star, although, as I'll cover, there are several other metrics and methods by which you can qualify. Initially, we're looking at 50,000 square feet for the first cycle. That ramps down to 25,000 square feet in the second, and eventually in the third cycle down to 10,000 square feet, with the caveat that all of the DC municipal government-owned buildings greater than 10,000 square feet are covered in the first cycle. Given that the cycles are 5 years, if you have not met your standard, your next 5-year cycle, you'll have to make the further improvements and catch back up so that you're meeting the standard for whether that's BEPS 1, BEPS 2, or BEPS 3. DC is working on a variety of pathways. We talked about the Energy Star rating pathway. There's also a performance pathway that if you can reduce your energy usage 20%, then you would automatically meet the standard. The Department of Energy and Environment is also developing prescriptive pathways. These would implement specific cost-effective efficiency measures. Those may be sector-specific based on certain building types, and it will allow certainty for building owners, particularly those that may not have the resources to do significant design work in-house or may not have significant capital resources in-house and don't want to take the risk that performance won't follow as expected. This is an area where in our stakeholder sessions with local building owners and local NGOs, we believe a financing product that's tailored to that prescriptive pathway may be particularly helpful. And we'll be working with DOEE once those pathways are released to see if there are particular green bank products that we can provide that would give a sort of one-stop shopping for a simple technology path along with simple financing to help support that technology. And so I can't help but refer to Bob Wyman, your question. I think that would be a pathway, and I would expect that heat pump replacement would be a part of any of those prescriptive pathways. There's also certain standard target pathways where if there are property types that are above a national median, you may be able to reach a standard rather than trying to meet the median within DC. This is trying to account for certain types of buildings that are exceeding the national performance and may have challenges ratcheting further above the local median. And then in other cases, we're looking at alternative compliance pathways, deep retrofits, education campuses, other large groups of buildings that may be managed differently or need a different pathway for the campus as a whole. Those are also under development, but wanted to provide that flexibility for certain special scenarios. There are several entities within DC government that are working to make sure that the transition and the building energy performance standards are implemented as painlessly as possible. Closely partnering with Department of Energy and Environment are the DC Green Bank, which I obviously represent, DC PACE program, which will be administered by DC Green Bank. DC Sustainable Energy Utility is a separate instrumentality that's funded by ratepayer surcharges and managed by a contract under the Department of Energy and Environment. SEU typically is providing more technical support and certain rebates for specific implementations. And the final entity here is just launching this fall the High Performance Building Hub, which will be focused on giving broad information to building owners and really be a convening for discussions between building owners to be more commercially focused. As an example of the type of support that SEU provides, today they're giving standard rebates, instant rebates, as well as performance-based rebates for larger commercial buildings. So they're in a natural position to support the building energy performance standard work. Financing that we are offering as the DC Green Bank in place today, given that we're very early in our development stage, we have an open RFP. This is really designed for larger projects. It's a flexible mechanism. We wanted to, again, follow in the footsteps of other green banks and have an open door so that innovative proposals in areas that we may not have been thinking of or structures that we may not have been thinking of are encouraged. We're open to it and really looking forward to working with a variety of proposals in that space. So certainly for, I think a good example for this would be colleges and universities or hospital campuses would be an obvious fit where a specific proposal for compliance and exceeding the building energy performance standard might be an avenue for that open RFP. Our next two products are developed, they're actually developed by the Montgomery County Green Bank, but as we were looking for ways to move quickly and support BEPS and deploy resources quickly in the DC economy, given the pandemic economy that we're all facing, we looked to other green banks for models. And given that there's a regional green bank just over the county line that has an existing contractor network, an existing lender network, we wanted to partner with them to create a broader, more regional market. But certainly in the DC area, contractors and lenders are expected to work in Maryland, DC, and Virginia. And so a consistent offering across those jurisdictions makes sense. The first product that Montgomery County Green Bank has developed and that we expect to be offering hopefully within a couple of weeks, we're in the final documentation stages right now, is called the CLEAR program. It's Commercial Loan for Energy Efficiency and Renewables. Although there's a minimum of $15,000, there's currently a cap except for specific exceptions on $250,000. But this program, as it has been deployed in Montgomery County, has actually been most used for larger projects. So we expect that to be the case here. Key components is that the financing is based on the energy savings. It allows up to 100% financing. And on the back end, we're providing a loan loss reserve for the commercial lenders who are actually providing the capital. So this is a successful program in Montgomery County, and we're really excited to bring it to DC. And we think it will be helpful, in particular, since it's focused on building efficiency and the potential for solar, which can help on DC's scores on building energy performance. We think this will be helpful for those who are looking to make upgrades to meet the standards. The standards right now are based on a Maryland program that PEPCO has implemented, but it's fairly typical in terms of what's eligible. PV, energy storage, as well as typical efficiency upgrades. Looking out further down the timeline, the Montgomery County Green Bank has also just launched a small business energy savings support program. It's really targeted to businesses that are struggling in the pandemic and are being required to make certain upgrades for energy efficiency and for additional safety, for example, increased ventilation or keyless card readers, those types of necessary upgrades. This loan product is designed to be able to support a broader range of acceptable upgrades. It's also targeted at small companies, less than 500 employees, and with relatively small demand. They're working on the first few installations of this loan in Montgomery County, and as soon as that's finalized, then we expect to be offering it with the same commercial partner. It's working with a local CDFI that's based in DC. Over the longer term, one of the regular comments that we've heard from developers is that a pre-development loan would be helpful. So something to help defray the upfront costs of engineering, design, and analysis, and to really validate with more technical certainty expected savings and expected costs. So we're working with a different green bank that has an existing product, offers a very low-cost loan, a 2-year term that can be extended, and then the loan is designed to be rolled into the permanent financing, whether it's at the construction stage or at the completion stage. So that's something we're in the very early stages of negotiating right now, but we expect that to be offered. It's probably going to be early next year before all the details on that are finalized. So then just to close it out, looking at the challenges that our building owners are facing, we also see those as opportunities, and really echoing a lot of the other comments that other jurisdictions have made here, the opportunity to create clean economy jobs that can't be outsourced, that require technical expertise and that are necessarily high paying is significant. And so looking to mine our building inefficiencies to create the new fleet of buildings in DC is something that we're really excited about. We really see that as a significant income generator from the city, as well as cost reduction on energy savings overall. So this opportunity to be supporting the BEPS is something that we at the Green Bank are really excited about. And across the board, we think it meets our key principles: reducing emissions, reducing local air pollution, working on clean economy jobs, and supporting inclusive prosperity for all of our residents. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Steve, and look forward to answering any questions.
Very good. Thank you very much, Eli. So again, please get your questions in the Q&A. We do have a bunch, and I'll get to those in a couple of minutes. I was going to kick things off by asking our panelists 2 questions. The first question is, New York City is planning to eventually require zero net carbon by 2050. And actually, I correct that, 80% reduction by 2050 through their building performance standard. For New York City, what are the challenges of mixing both energy efficiency and clean energy in a single standard? For DC and Washington State, do you see your standard eventually moving to or close to zero carbon? Why or why not? Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in if you want me to, Steve. So, I mean, I think your question rightfully points out kind of a new reality in New York for the buildings community, because this new law it hitches buildings to the grid because it's a carbon law. When it comes to electricity, building owners don't control carbon, they control energy. But this law makes them financially responsible for the carbon emissions that could be happening 100 miles away at the power plant. And so we need to have both now. So we need to understand what is the interaction with the building and the grid. We're doing a lot of grid focus at Urban Green on this. We just published the State of the Grid brief. We're not in a great place in New York. 70% of our electricity comes from a carbon base. The other 30% comes from a nuclear power plant that's closing next year. So we're going to go close to 100% carbon electricity in New York before we get better. And so that's the tough reality that we have in the middle of a law that's tying buildings to that grid. So we got a lot of work to do. Fortunately, there's been good leadership by the state of New York in enacting new laws and new programs to green the grid. Billions of dollars of contracts have been let by NYSERDA to create, for example, 2 offshore mega wind farms to green the grid in New York City. But those are a few years off, and so we've got some tough sledding to do between then.
Okay, Emily or Eli?
First, Steve, I'm happy to jump in from Washington State's perspective. And our building performance standard here in the state is based on site-based energy use. So it's energy use intensity at the site measured in BTUs per square foot per year. We've got ASHRAE standard 100 as the reference standard, which inherently sets that criteria. What we're really starting to see, though, is that misalignment between greenhouse gas emissions reductions goals and a system of standards that's been built on energy use intensity. Will we see a change over time? We may. We've received a lot of input from stakeholders about that. I think it's likely we will see that change over time. Here in the state of Washington, we're in the process of updating our state energy strategy. And so we're doing quite a bit of analysis on deep decarbonization pathways by multiple sectors and looking at economy-wide the interactions of those. So I think as we have that state energy strategy developed, a clear idea of where we want to head with our greenhouse gas emissions reductions goals, we may see the building performance standard change over time. But for now, that's the policy framework that we operate within.
Very good. Thank you. Eli?
So I'll take the prerogative of the financing entity here and not the regulatory entity and say that's a question for DDOE. But we'll work with the standard that is in place.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, my second question relates to financing. Do any of you have some sense about what percentage of properties might need financing in order to meet the first tier of your standard? And of those, what types of buildings do you think are particularly likely to need financing? Eli, why didn't I call on you first? Because you nicely dodged the previous one.
So what we're seeing initially, Steve, is that the types of buildings that are particularly needing financing support, to date, it's condos and cooperatives on the multifamily side, as those entities, typically as they are either affordable housing or approaching the affordable housing thresholds, often have lots of deferred maintenance. And so even before we get to addressing what the upgrade needs to be, we'll need to be doing a lot of work just to bring the building up to safety and security standards that it needs to see. And so for those entities, financing can be more challenging, particularly looking out for significant upgrades that are going to need to be made. We're less concerned about our larger commercial operators, our larger companies. Typically, in my discussions with them, they say, look, we've got sources of capital. We know how to do this. We think we'll be fine. So on the commercial side, it's really more the individually owned buildings, the smaller and the medium-sized buildings that we're seeing is really our target market. And that's where the interest and the optimism that we have around a prescriptive pathway approach that's coupled with some streamlined financing. That's still in the very early stages, since we haven't seen the pathways yet, but that's where I think the Green Bank in particular will be focusing.
Okay, thanks. John or Katie?
Steve, I'm happy to jump in from Washington again. So bottom line up front for your question is we don't know. We don't know what the needs are going to be with financing for the building performance standard. And the reason we don't know is because we actually don't even know how many buildings right now will be subject to the standard. As I mentioned, we're building that catalog of buildings that are over 50,000 square feet. Within those buildings that will be eligible for the standard, there's a number of different sectors that we'll need to take a look at for financing and how they will comply with the standard. Very important to note is the standard does apply to publicly owned buildings. So we've got state agencies, we've got schools, we've got local governments that will need to figure out how to comply with these standards and have very different mechanisms for financing. Then we look at the private market, and we know we've got a robust system of energy performance contracting here in the state of Washington. We also have a state-funded clean energy fund that has grants to nonprofit lenders. So we have the ability to bring commercial lending to projects that need some assistance. So long story short is we don't know. We're going to learn a lot during the incentive period and hopefully bring the necessary resources and make the connections, build capacity in the marketplace that we're going to need to have come mandatory compliance in 2026.
Okay, great, thank you. And John?
Yeah, like Washington, I don't think we all know, but I could break it down this way. So the first compliance period is in 4 years. 10,000 buildings, 10,000 large buildings. These are buildings 25,000 square feet and above. 10,000 of them have to reduce carbon to meet the cap. The majority of those are multifamily. So my guess is, many, if not most, will need financing of some form or another to reduce energy and reduce carbon. So that's why the commercial PACE program uptick in New York City is going to be really important. That's why we hope the carbon a trading market for buildings starts to work to provide a different type of financing, because there's going to be a lot that needs to be done. We anticipate, for that first compliance period, about $3 billion, $2 to $3 billion will need to be spent on energy retrofits. That's a lot. It's when you get to the 2030 that you tag on another additional $18 billion for that total $20 billion market. So that's kind of the size of the financing pie that needs to be addressed.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we do have a number of questions in the Q&A box, and I'll start asking some of them. For people who have additional questions, put them in the Q&A box. First question from Bob Wyman. Question is, why not keep it simple? If decarbonization is the goal, a simple requirement to use heat pumps for space and water heat would eliminate most of the problem. Why not do the simple thing? This is Steve, and I will start an answer, but ask any of the other panelists to see if they have something to add. To do efficiency will typically lower the total cost and improve the economics of heat pumps. We have a study coming out probably around the end of October that will detail that for many different types of commercial buildings. I would also note that if you switch everybody over to heat pumps during a polar vortex, there could be enormous winter peak demands. And we did a paper for our summer study looking at that, but using efficiency, using load management, using many other strategies, you can help manage those increased peaks. But we definitely do have to think about it before everybody starts slapping heat pumps on every inefficient building out there. So I think heat pumps, renewable energy, and energy efficiency all go hand in hand, as opposed to just one thing will solve the problem. But do any other panelists have something they want to add there?
Steve, I'm happy to add just a couple of thoughts. And I think, the point is well taken. Like, in designing programs, the simple ones are likely the most effective. A couple key points I want to add to what you stated, Steve, is that within Washington's program, we have requirements for operations and maintenance plans, for example. So even not taking into account equipment changes, looking at how we operate buildings over time. What local research here in the state of Washington would indicate is a thoughtfully implemented O&M plan will reduce energy use in that building between 8 to 10% alone. So I just want to be really careful in thinking about that. Simplicity is important, and there's so many other opportunities that we would be missing from my perspective in that kind of approach.
Great, thank you. Next question from Megan Hackey. Are these types of mandates viable in smaller cities and towns? How might you adjust the design implementation of the policy to support smaller municipalities? Anybody want to take that?
I can jump on that, Steve. I think my recommendation would be for smaller cities to look at energy and not carbon. It's a little bit easier for the building owner to manage, particularly if you're talking about smaller buildings, particularly if you're getting down to residential, small residential, single family or two family homes. You get to the same place, it just leads to different strategies. And so I would advise any city, even a large city, our blueprint for efficiency in New York, it recommended an energy efficiency approach, not a carbon approach. The city wanted a carbon law, and so we worked to make it feasible. But I would recommend starting with energy.
Thanks. Any other responses? Okay, not hearing anything from Rob Harmon. How do these mandates address the split of incentive between landlords and tenants? I'll just leave it at that without the commentary.
I can jump in. The building performance standard here in Washington is a building owner responsibility. So how building owners address that with their tenants, I think, is yet to be determined. What I would note, with split incentives, I understand the intent of that question is building owners and tenants. What we do have here in the state of Washington, though, is that buildings that utilize multiple fuels. And so with our utility participation, we are going to have multiple utilities potentially bringing incentive resources to the table proportional to the energy savings resulting from the improvement. So it's an interesting issue and an interesting question, and we'll know quite a bit more as we move forward with our incentive program.
Any other thoughts?
I'll just add this. I mean, we've got to get at it, right? I mean, it's been around for forever. But here's something, maybe a different twist on it. So in New York City right now, the latest I've heard is that commercial buildings have lost about 80% of their occupancy right now with people working at home. Yeah, energy use is down only 30%. And so that right there underscores the problem that we have. And so why is energy down just 30%? Well, there's a lot of phantom energy going on in the buildings. We thought we knew building energy use, but we're discovering it all over again. People left copiers on, people left, things plugged in. The other thing we find out is that, there are servers in the buildings that are helping people work at home that are using, the energy that's there. But the biggest issue is the building owners are maintaining the lease. And so if a commercial tenant has a lease that says, I want 72 degrees in my office 7 days a week, that's what's being delivered, whether there's one person there, 0 people there, or 100 people there. So that gets at this split incentive that we're going to have to get at this issue if we're going to reduce the carbon.
Okay, thank you. Picking up on the tenant issue, Katie Janda asked, perhaps from the UK, I don't know if she's still over there, but in terms of new business models to support building performance standards, do any of the speakers' programs utilize green leases to assist with tenanted properties? Not hearing any. It sounds like the answer is so far people are not doing it. Please correct me if I got that wrong.
That's correct in Washington.
Okay. Shall we say a possible opportunity? Okay. A question from Lewis Reif. Given the push from the regulatory perspective, how is finance working to ensure that building owners don't simply adopt the penalties as a cost rather than making the needed efficiency improvements?
Well, in New York, the fine is $268 per ton over the cap every year. For some of these large buildings that have high density, we're looking at $3, $4, $5 million a year fine. And so I think the stick is too heavy that, building owners will, I hope, and we're working with them to look at ways that they can comply in a cost-effective way versus just paying a fine. Because at the end of the day, we need the carbon reduction. I don't care about the fine. We need the carbon reduction. So let's find a way to get them into compliance. And instead of paying the city for a fine, let's pay another building to go below their cap, and so we get the carbon reduction through something like carbon trading.
Great, thanks. Anybody else?
So the penalties here in Washington state that Commerce has the authority to assess are $1 per square foot per year, and that was listed in the statute itself. I think it's a great question, and I think we will only know with time as we assess those penalties why building owners are opting to pay them. Is it by choice because they don't want to invest in the upgrades, or do they not have the means and mechanisms to do so? Basically the fines will be at least $50,000. and will scale with the size of the building, and only time will tell whether or not that is compelling enough for some building owners to move forward with making upgrades versus opting for the penalty over time. I don't know.
I would also note that it sounds like there may be an interesting experiment. New York City sounds like it's going to be higher penalties because they can be in the millions of dollars per building per year. Yes, I know the buildings are larger often, but we'll see how things go in the different jurisdictions, and probably we'll learn a lot. Okay, next question is from Phil Mosenthal. Can you discuss more around how utility traditional energy efficiency programs will deal with this in terms of how they evaluate savings, develop counterfactual baselines, efficiencies, and free ridership? Phil, ACEEE has been delving into these issues, and we should have a paper on it about mid-October that will go into quite a bit of this. But a key question is going to be, how do you define baseline? Do you define baseline assuming everybody meets the standard and no one's paying penalties regardless of what type of building? Or do you come up with a baseline that might be below the standard, at least for affordable housing, hard to reach in others? I know New York State is starting a proceeding and discussions about that. Other people are doing it as well. Our sense is that at least for some, if not many building types, the baselines will be defined at a lower level, at least for some building types, than everybody complies. But that's going to be a key question. Once you establish the baseline, then you start figuring out, well, who gets credit for savings, how much savings. Obviously, if they're below the baseline, there's no credit. But if they can, meet that baseline, or, you can get savings beyond that, maybe you will get credit. Happy to discuss it with you more offline. Also, I think you'll be very interested in a lot of the new paper that will be coming out. Okay. I'm going to mispronounce this. I cut Yilmaz asks, many BEPS standards are agnostic on the question of whether efficiency improvements should promulgate further investments in fossil fuels, with the exception of greenhouse gas standard. Should financing be agnostic, or should financing be limited to investments aligned with electrification?
I'll start on that, Steve. So of all the carbon emissions in New York City, 40% come from burning fossil fuels at the building. 40%. That's greater than all transportation sources. So we have to electrify. It's the only way we're going to get to the 80% reduction. And so, we would hope that incentives will be more weighted, if not exclusively weighted, towards electrification, because our need is so great. It's 40% in New York City. The data I looked at said it's about a third statewide, but it's only about 10% nationally. It's weighted more heavily in cities like New York that have an older building stock, that are on radiator heat in cool climates. With large multifamily housing. And so you can pick your cities that are in that bucket, but it's a big challenge for us.
Anybody else? Okay, one last question from Andrea Jacob in Portland. How are you all incorporating or centering equity and racial justice into the implementation of these mandates? Eli, I know DC has some specific provisions you might want to address.
Well, speaking from the DC Green Bank perspective, I think a key component for us is making sure both that the work that's being done on the buildings across the city is done by local contractors who are diverse in a variety of manners, and our financing will be targeted at supporting that metric. Similarly, making sure that the buildings that are being upgraded across the city. We're very proud that our first projects were in Ward 7 and 8. We're on nationally affordable housing projects there. And we're also supporting DC Solar for All program, which sends the electrical output to low and middle income homeowner or residents and providing them with the benefit of solar, even if they're not able to put solar on their own roofs. So there's a variety of programs that we're looking at and considerations that we're looking at. It's definitely a core policy driver for us, but we're also open to suggestions, and we've had a series of stakeholder conversations, and we'll be having many more with community members and leaders over the course of the fall as we're designing our projects.
And I know for affordable housing, some additional time is allowed, and a variety of other steps are at least being discussed. And John, did you want to say anything about New York City?
Yeah, so, let's just take carbon trading as part of that. We believe that carbon trading can be designed with environmental justice communities first and foremost in mind. Because let's face it, the city's budget coffers are drained, the state's budget coffers are drained. We need a new source of capital to finance carbon reductions in environmental justice communities, and we think carbon trading can be it. We could give 2-to-1 credit in environmental justice communities to drive a market. We can do a lot of different incentives to make sure that if carbon reductions are going to happen, they happen first in environmental justice communities from a trading standpoint. So it's front and center in the work that we're doing.
Great, thank you. And I also know in New York City, rent control apartments just have a set of prescriptive standards and not the performance standard. They were trying to keep the cost down. So I would say these are factors in many of the cities, but it definitely needs attention. With that, we are out of time. I wanted to thank all of our speakers, as well as the Nick and Maxine and other ACEEE staff who helped to put this on. Thank you all for your questions. I hope you learned a lot. And it is a hot topic, and I'm sure we at ACEEE will be doing more. But if you have specific questions for specific speakers, you can follow up with them afterwards. With that, thank you all, and have a good rest of the day.